I
Not
fell
yet.
asleep, so I couldn't be there, but I've been meaning to watch it.
Okay. They've been kind of interesting calls. They're very, very slow at times. I gotta imagine it's kind of hard to watch because there's a lot of the call where somebody will say something and then we just kind of stare at each other for a few seconds while we're waiting to figure out who's going to say something next. And I don't always know how much to chip in. The purpose of these calls is not to tell you what I think, but to get you to tell me what you think. And so sometimes I deliberately stay quiet for a while because I want to see if somebody gets uncomfortable enough to say something. And unfortunately, we we end up having some really good conversations that I think could really help people on the discussion board. But because they're not part of the calls, they don't really know the kinds of things to talk about on the discussion board. So there's a little bit of an advantage to those of you who are on the calls on Tuesdays because you haven't even had to make your primary post yet. You've still got a whole nother day before you have to make that primary post, and you can kind of think about what we talked about on these calls. And then you kind of have an idea of some things that you can follow up with on what other people say. So for that, if for that reason alone, I would think it just kind of makes sense to be on as many of these as you can. And I'll be interested to see how the discussion progresses tonight as we talk about pay for potential and give Morgan an opportunity to share some of the things that she has learned as she was researching. She's acting all nervous over there, but she's going to do a great job. Because what I've been reading in the discussion board so far really sounds like people haven't done their primary research. They don't really know what pay for potential is. They're kind of making some assumptions based upon the way that we label this thing, and they're putting it into a context that may not be correct. So the three of you, well, Morgan already knew this, but the other two of you will have a better idea coming out of this phone call what pay for potential is really all about and why that actually does make sense in a lot of regards. So without stepping on anything that Morgan's going to share with us, we'll give it to her until she feels good about turning it over with some sort of conversation starter.
Dr. Grimes, I do have one question about the pay for potential. You know how some companies will pay for the college? Could that be considered as paying for potential?
I would say no, mainly because paying for college is really more of a benefit.
Okay.
Tuition reimbursement kind of thing, and that's right. Irrelevant of your salary. That's an employee benefit that we offer to people because it will make them more valuable, but it's not tied to their compensation at all. And generally, pay for potential is tied to their salary or their hourly wage or their compensation. So they really kind of are, in some regards, they might complement each other a little bit, but they're kind of two different categories of things.
Okay.
All right, so give us the overview, Morgan, of what you found as you were reading and preparing your list of recommended articles.
Okay, well, paying for potential means for an employee to have higher wages because of the potential they can eventually offer a company. And I've come across it's called the 9-grid box, which is often used to collect data for current employees or even future employees based on their performance and their potential. So they're weighing both of those. I had a box example here pulled up while we were discussing it. But and I also use this in my talking points. The theory is that having a team filled with A players is better because these players bring knowledge and have initiative and are invested. So top talent and top potential. Whenever when they're using this 9-box grid, they have like potential going up one way and then performance going the other. So if they have like good performance, but their potential is low, they'll put them in the bottom left corner. So they'll kind of go up from there. with using the grid. And I thought the grid was, I mean, it's the most commonly used tool when trying to rate the potential and the performance of an employee or even a future employee.
Okay. Let's jump off from there. What we typically do at appraisal time, and remember that appraisals are used for a couple of things. Y'all give me some thoughts on why do we do appraisals? What do we as managers do with the outcomes of appraisals?
We use appraisals to give employees feedback over their performance from the last year, and so that they can go and develop in the next year.
All right, so one reason that we do appraisals is that's a good tool to use to give them feedback.
You're also documenting what they do good, what they're not doing good. So if you have to let them go later, you have documentation of the reasons why.
Okay, so we use them to give feedback to the employees one-on-one about what they've done, and we also use that same appraisal to make permanent notes for decisions that we're going to have to make in the future. Okay, so we can tie appraisals not only to what happened in the last 12 months, but also to documentation and reinforcement for things that may happen over the next few months or over the next couple of years. It's a good thing to consider that appraisals both help us looking backwards and looking forwards. All right, besides feedback to the employee and documentation or proof maybe to support or to justify the decisions that we have to make in the future, and let's interrupt there, what kinds of decisions might we make?
Promotions, terminations, things like that. Who's eligible for training, who needs training, things like that.
Okay. Great. We use appraisals to figure out who needs training in what areas, who needs to get promoted, who needs to get separated. Why else do we use appraisals? Feedback decisions. What's the most common reason why we do appraisals?
To justify the performance awards that we give an employee for their previous performance.
Put the term performance awards in different words.
Compensation for
Keep going. Compensation in what regards?
Compensation for their job for the previous year.
Okay.
We determine the value. We determine their value to the company, like the point method of evaluation kind of thing. Maybe.
Okay. What do we do with that? What do we do with that value? Tying back into what Amy was just talking about. She hit the
We are justifying their salary.
There you go. When we talk about the rewards and things, we use appraisals to figure out what we can justify paying them next year. And so traditionally, how do we use appraisals? How do we make the decisions on what we're going to pay them next year?
On their past performance or what they could offer the company?
Good. Yes. We traditionally decide what to pay you next year based upon what you did last year. So if you had a good year last year, you can get a raise. If for some reason some things were going on and you had a bad year, you might not get a raise. Is that fair? I mean, is that a fair summation? Is that reasonably accurate?
In most organizations.
Yeah.
Okay. In most organizations, what you can expect to get paid next year is a reflection of what you did last year. That's the way we've used performance appraisals in the past. So that is what we would talk about, pay for performance.
Mm-hmm.
How does that come as an incentive to you as an employee?
It encourages me to want to perform at a greater level so that I can get compensated at a greater level in the next year.
Okay. Good.
Well, also, wouldn't pay for potential do the same? I mean, you would want to like live up to what they're paying you for.
Okay.
Paying for potential.
I'm going to transition into pay for potential in just a second, but you're still kind of taking pay for potential out of the context that it was designed. And let's welcome Kenneth to the call here real quick. We are talking about the difference between how we normally use appraisals, and we're going to transition into the idea of the topic for this week, how we could start to use appraisals, or how we can start to figure out how to use those things to make decisions. And we've said that traditionally we look at what you did last year, and hopefully we remember what you did the first 2 months of last year, and that has an equal impact or an equal bearing on your performance appraisal as the last month or two. We could spend a lot of time talking about the kinds of problems that we experience where appraisals don't come out fair. We can talk about recency, which is that we only remember the last month or two. We can talk about halo, which is where you had a pretty lousy year, but there's something about you that I like, and I'm willing to ignore some of the bad things because there's that good thing. Okay, there's the opposite of that, which is horns. You may have had a great year, but there's something about you that just bugs me. And it's hard for me to recognize the good stuff because there's that one bad thing that really just gripes on me. We as an example of that, we might say, you know, you've met all the goals that we gave you, but you were late a lot. And we end up giving you a poor performance because you're late all the time. And that one thing clouds the rest of your performance. That's the horns effect. Okay, so halo and horns and recency. There are a lot of other kinds of biases that enter into this when we use the rating scales 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. You have leniency, where you tend to give people 4s and 5s because you don't want conflict, or because, you know, if I don't give 4s and 5s, I've got to spend a lot of time telling my supervisor why, and it's just easier to give you a grade that they're not going to question. There is severity, which is where we tend to mark everybody 1s and 2s, maybe because, and if we back up, sometimes we will fall into the trap of leniency because we're supposed to be basing our appraisals off of some set of expectations. And it may be that our expectations are too low and everybody exceeds our expectations. That's a problem, isn't it? If we do an analysis of our performance appraisals for our team and everybody is getting really high ratings, then our standards may be too low and we may need to raise our standards. The opposite of that is harshness or severity, and that's where maybe our standards are too high. And they just, as hard as they try, they may not stack up to our expectations for them. And so we score them 1s and 2s. And then you have central tendency, which is where you kind of give everybody the middle of the road. And we might say, you know what, it's just unreasonable to give anybody a 5. A teacher might say, you know, I'm just not going to give hundreds because nobody's perfect. Well, you know, you may have a really darn good paper that you wrote. And I can't go into my grading thinking 100 needs to be unattainable because that's not fair to you. And it's okay to make it challenging as long as I'm fair. And so we may have some managers that just put everybody down a 3. I've worked at organizations before where there were very few people who got 1s and 2s, largely because I, as a manager, didn't want to have to sit down with you and tell you what's wrong with you. I would rather just give you a 3 because you get a raise that way, and we just kind of ignore the problems and hope they go away. I also, as a manager, might have a tendency, because I'm just a softie or because I really want to see all of my people do well, to give out 4s and 5s when they're not justified. But I also might be in a position where if I give you a 1 or if I give you a 5, no matter which one it is, it means that you're significantly low or significantly high, and I've got to justify why. And golly, I just don't want to spend the time to write a paragraph every time I put a 5. So I'm not going to give any. But that unfairly moves the rating system to where it doesn't accurately reflect performance. And yet that's what we base a lot of our decisions on when it comes to raises. And typically what we'll do, we have a grid in the past, or currently maybe, it may have 9 boxes on it. And either probably the rows going across are the levels of performance. And if we have this thing that's math-based, what percent of the time did you did this, or how many of these, depending on what range you fall in, you're on one of the rows or another one of the rows. And we try to stack people up according to their performance that way. The columns in that kind of a appraisal typically have something to do with seniority. If you're in your first 5 years and you're an outstanding performer, you're not going to get as much of a raise as somebody who is an outstanding performer in their 6th through 10th year, and maybe not as much as somebody in their 11th through 15th year. And we kind of justify a little bit of the discrepancy in our rating system and in the raises that we give based upon how well they performed and how long they've been here. But all of that looks at the past, doesn't it? You've got an unfair advantage because you've been here for 12 years. And if you've been here for 12 years, that's okay. But if you've been here 3 years and somebody who has been here a lot longer than you consistently gets better ratings, largely because they've been here longer than you, that's kind of demotivating, isn't it? Have you ever been in a position where, through whatever grapevine informal communication channels exist, you know that somebody who's not as valuable to the company as you are in terms of what you can do gets a better rating than you because of something that really shouldn't matter? Got to unmute. Kenneth.
So I guess my claim to fame on that question would be we have this performance appraisal system in the military where, let's say, the 5 of us that are in here right now, let's say you got here 3 years ago, Amy got here 2.5 years ago, and so on and so forth. Solely because I'm the new guy, regardless of what I do, I cannot get into the upper rungs of performance because the way the system is set up is you've been at the top, or you waited your time at the bottom of the list. You've been there the longest, and you have rightfully earned your place at the top within reason. You may have had a slip here or there, but they actually factor in that you've been here for so long that, no, this is the hot runner. He's going to leave out of here in about X amount. Boom, this is our guy. And a lot of the scoring on the evaluation is not necessarily based on your performance. It's based on, okay, well, let's say there's 7 categories between 1 and 5. And let's say that the CO's average is a 4.0. Well, everybody's going to start off at a 4.0 regardless of what they actually did. And it completely doesn't take into account how good of a job you did. Now it does suffer from that. Let's say you did something and you completely messed up, fell off the boat, you fell off the mountain. You're going to get a 3, and you're going to get sandbagged, and that pushes everybody up that much higher just because. Like, one of my projects over the long term is to hopefully try and influence that process to be redone. It's just that it's difficult trying to come up with something different because it's that in and of itself is a process too. But it's like everything that you mentioned, central tendency, severity, leniency, like all of that I've seen. Is just I don't have the civilian experience to kind of to mesh it to that side of the street.
Okay. If you're thinking about trying to change the way the military does things, you're going to have a challenge in front of you. All right. So maybe that's a little bit of a framework. The way that we've always done it is to establish you for next year, depending. I'm not sure if I'm saying this right. We get you set up for next year based almost entirely on what you did last year, and that means that if you've been with us 4 years and you had 3 really lousy years and 1 pretty good year, you're going to stand to do well. Somebody else who's been here 4 years that had 3 amazing years and then 1 lousy year probably won't do very well. But it also means that, especially to younger people, and I'm going to put all 4 of y'all in this category, what's the likelihood that you're going to stay with whatever, accepting the military, which is for a lot of people a lifetime commitment, but outside the military, the federal government kind of thing, what's the likelihood that somebody going into a job now, your age, will be there 20 years from now? Probably very low, right?
Very low.
Not very high. All right. Why is that? Why would you be likely to move to another job?
Just for more opportunities to move and things like that.
Okay. More opportunity and more money. Okay. Does it seem reasonable to you that to get more money does not necessarily mean that you have to do grander things, because you may already, generally speaking, be deserving of more money, but to get more money you got to leave and go somewhere else? Is that kind of the mindset of this generation? I'm not willing to wait here for 10 years to get to where I think that I really deserve to be, if I can get there through a shortcut by going somewhere else.
Sure.
Okay. So if you're with Jones Company right now and you're making $25,000 a year, and you know that right now Stevens Company sees something in you and is willing to give you 30. It's pretty logical that you leave Jones and go to Stevens, doesn't it? But why is Stevens willing to give you more? Why is Stevens willing to give you more?
Probably because Steven has a harder time keeping somebody in that spot.
Maybe, but based upon the way that I framed the question.
You're already trained and you already know what to do.
Okay. The way that I framed the question, Stephen's willing to give you more because they see something in you. They see some, what's the magic word?
Potential.
Potential. Yeah. Okay. So when we generally talk about pay for potential, we're not talking about, I'm going to hire you off the street and pay you a lot of money because I think you might have something. What we're talking about is you've been with us for 3 years. And I could see you being a manager. I could see you working your way up to CEO. And because you've got some potential there that somebody else doesn't have, I'm going to justify paying you a little bit more because I need to keep you. And as long as we can work on this thing and we can grow you into the potential that I feel is there, it's justifiable to pay you a little bit more. So where we used to have a performance appraisal grid that looked at how you performed last year and maybe how long you've been with us, now we have, let's see if that'll make, I can make that, I have to do this backwards looking at my camera here. The pay for potential grid still has the 9 boxes, but up the side we have the performance, which is the past, and across the top we have the potential, which is the future. And so what you did last year has an impact on what you get paid next year. But this gives us the flexibility as a manager to say, all right, you've only been here 3 years. And this guy over here has been with us for 12 years. But you've got potential that he doesn't have. You know, the downside of me losing him in 5 years is that, well, he's kind of getting closer to retirement anyway. I'm going to lose him at some point. The downside of me losing you within 5 years is that there is a future that I've missed. And if I, as a manager, can justify the potential that I see in you, I can go ahead and maybe prepay you, in a sense, some of those wages to keep you bought into the company, to keep you loyal to the company, to stay here. Again, provided that I do my job as a manager and help you grow into the potential that I see. And a lot of the burden is on me as a manager because not everybody sees the same potential. And just because maybe I see the potential in one of you as a student, you know, I can't just kind of wait around and float on the fringes and see if you develop it. I have to do my part proactively to bring it out of you. Now, does that kind of border on the possibility of playing favorites?
I guess to a certain degree, a lot of people have the idea of paying for potential because a lot of times when they're looking at performance, they're looking at someone that's been in position for a long time versus somebody that's new in position, and they're like, well, this person's been in position for 10 years, so they should be performing at a greater level than this person that's just been here for 2 years. But yet this person that's been here for 2 years is outperforming this other person. So they want to give this person a better performance review, but technically if you look at their performance standards, they're both meeting them and they're both exceeding them. But you look at them and you're like, they should be performing at a greater level because of the amount of time that they've been with the company. So essentially, I think to a certain degree, we kind of do think about paying for potential when we're doing the performance appraisals. It's just that we're just not necessarily thinking of that term.
Okay. One of the challenges we have with the existing appraisal system is that we don't have the flexibility to pay you for what we think might happen. We have to pay you on what actually occurred in the past. And as you were kind of talking about there, somebody who's been in that same job for 10 years ought to outperform somebody who's new. And yet, because they are good at their job and it is very routine and it's, you know, second nature, unconscious activity, that may be the best they ever get. And they may be an outstanding employee, but they're never going to be better. But the person who's kind of figuring out how to do it, that had a good year, has got off the charts potential. Now, when we're a manager trying to pay for potential, it really can't come down to our perception. Y'all still with me? Good. It looked like everybody was kind of frozen there. I was afraid maybe that my internet had gone bad or something. Okay, somebody's got to move every now and then just so I know that I'm not frozen. Okay. Lean forward, go sideways, put your hand on your chin, because I can look at all four of you at the same time. All right, so it can't be just our judgment. The pay for potential really has to be where a lot of folks are saying, you know what, there's something about Kenneth, or there's something about Morgan. You know, Morgan could be a superstar. If we can keep her long enough and groom her and develop her, you know, what do we do to keep her? Well, we give her more challenging assignments. We give her some more authority. We give her some more responsibility. But I mean, how long will you stay somewhere with increasing responsibility and increasing authority if there's not accompanying money? The pay
Not
for
long at all.
potential. The pay for potential is that little bit of a carrot sometimes that we don't offer to everybody. We want to keep the good people, but we really want to keep the outstanding people. And I think one of the obstacles sometimes to doing a pay for potential is that it requires us to look down the road a little ways. It requires us as managers to say, okay, you know, it's not going to be a whole lot longer before Sam retires. Or, you know, Judy has been an outstanding performer, but her health is starting to slip a little bit. And it's going to come a time where she can't do what she's always done. We have a challenge as managers to think about who's going to replace Judy when that time comes. Who's going to be ready to step into Sam's position when he retires? And we've got to start working on that now, don't we? We can't just hope that somebody's ready when that day comes. And as gruesome as it sounds, the fact that anybody could get hit by a bus any day means that we've always got to be thinking about that, even if Morgan's nowhere near retirement. We got to be thinking about who the next Morgan is. We got to be thinking about who's going to take Amy's place when that time comes. And we've got to start getting them ready now. And we've got to even go beyond that. We can't say, all right, you know, what if something happened to Ashley today? Well, Morgan could step in her spot. So let's be working on Morgan and developing Morgan. Well, something does happen to Ashley. But doggone it, Morgan just left, just turned in her 2-week notice to go somewhere else. Now there's nobody. So we're kind of straying off the topic a little bit in terms of the appraisals, but in terms of career management and personal and personnel development, as we're thinking about, you know, who's next in line after Kenneth, it works well for us if we've got 2 or 3 people that we're grooming, any one of which could take his place when the time comes. Kenneth.
So the 9 grid kind of goes hand in hand with succession management.
It can be very, very closely tied, yes. And I didn't hold it up long enough for you to really kind of see what I did with this. We start off saying, okay, somebody who is a low performer last year, who doesn't have a whole lot of potential, may still get a raise, but not a huge one. Somebody who's a low performer last year, but who has off the charts potential, why did they have a bad year last year? Well, it may be because they weren't trained well in this job, or maybe that our standards were too high for him or her. And just everybody has a bad year from time to time. But even somebody who has a bad year that has tremendous potential can get a raise that's equivalent to somebody who has an outstanding year but really has no potential. And somebody who has a great year last year and has great potential for the future could get an amazing raise. And so there is flexibility from 2 standpoints here. We can reward the people who did well last year, and we ought to. If you're a baseball player and you have an amazing statistical year, you ought to get a raise. But there comes a point in time where you don't have an awful lot to give us into the future. And we need to start recognizing some of those folks who haven't had those superstar years yet, but who are probably going to be having them very soon. And we need to make sure that we don't lose them before they have those superstar years. We got to make sure that they don't have those superstar years for somebody else. Kenneth.
So I'm kind of piecing it together. So so let's say you don't necessarily have to give, like, I think the lower left-hand corner was a 2. And I'm assuming that's if you wanted to, if the company were to give out raises, that's just the likelihood. I guess the likelihood, if there were one given, who would get more of a cut out of it because they mean the most. So, okay, I see what you're saying now. It just took a minute for all the cylinders to start firing.
Okay. The main thing I want you to think about from this particular grid is not the numbers that are in it, but the intersections. because the low last year and the low future may be a 0, or it could be a 1, or it could be a 5. The idea is that as you move up diagonally to the right, the numbers get larger. And it means also that a good last year but a poor future means as much to us as a bad last year with an outstanding future. Ashley.
Okay, I was reading in one of the articles that Morgan posted that you can have high performers, but they're not high potential. So I'm wondering, how do you fairly differentiate the high performers from the high potential? Like, how can you say you're a really good performer but you don't have potential? Like, what criteria are we using?
That becomes very difficult. The last year ought to be very clear cut. Here's numbers. We can't argue about numbers. And we need to stay away from, as much as we can, things like, this is a good team player. Well, yeah, they are. Oh, they're really good. Oh, they're kind of good. Oh, they're not so good. What do you mean I'm kind of good? I'm really good. We disagree on it. If we stay away from those things, that's the objective part, is the past. And you're right, the future is very subjective. You may think that you have off the charts potential, and I may not see it. Amy.
At one of my previous positions, we did strategic planning, and we did look at high potential, high performers. And your high performer is somebody that may have been in position for many years, that has no desire to advance in the company, that is a strong structure in the company, that without them we would technically be lost. But yet they don't have any desire to promote. But then yet you have somebody that's new to the company, they have high potential to promote, they're a great performer. So that person goes into the high potential, high performer, whereas the other one is just a high performer.
Okay. And there can be different ways that we measure that potential. It could be potential for growth within the company. It could be potential in the way that you describe here, that they don't ever want to be a manager. But golly, if that secretary left, everybody would be in a world of hurt. She's just too valuable.
Right.
And there's potential in terms of not only growth, but instability. And we can reward for potential in whatever way we see fit. Yes, ma'am.
Even somebody that you might see leadership skills in that maybe doesn't even see it yet in themselves, but they have the potential and you want to invest in them.
Absolutely. Now back to the question, when we sit down with you and share this grid with you, and we say, you had an amazing year last year, we're going to give you 6% raise. Well, if that's all I tell you, you think 6%, man, that's great. I'm happy with it. But what that means on my grid is that you don't have a whole lot of potential, or at least I'm not seeing it yet in a way that is valuable for the organization. And that can be a tough conversation to have. But pay for potential gives us the flexibility as managers to reward people before something happens, because we feel like the likelihood of it happening and paying off big is great. And sometimes it's really not a whole lot more than a gut feeling. I don't know if this is a good example or not, but I look at my kids, and on one of them I can say, man, I can see the possibility of you being a doctor. And another one I can say, you're not ever going to be a doctor, but you're going to be good at this. And the other one I'm going to say, you might be a ball player, but you're not going to be a doctor. You're not going to be a teacher. I mean, and we see potential in different directions at different levels with different people. In the business world, there are some kinds of potential that are really, really valuable. And if all we have to go on to keep you here next year is how well did you do last year, we may not be able to keep you real long. But if every now and then we can say, listen, Morgan, you have got so much potential. I can see so much of the uncut diamond. If we can keep you interested, if we can keep you challenged, if we can continue to give you the resources to where you can grow, man, the sky is the limit for you. What does it take to keep you here? Appreciate me, pay me a little bit more. Okay, well, I can pay you a little bit more. I can justify a little bit more. You earned a 4% raise. I could justify 5. If that is one of the pieces that helps keep one of my rising stars here. one of the other benefits of this from the opposite direction is if you get the news several years in a row, you had a pretty decent year, you had a great year, you had a poor year, whatever, but we've about topped out what we can get from you. I mean, the potential is not real high. You might eventually say it's not worth staying here. And so the lower end, especially that bottom left-hand corner, we start to kind of weed out because there's no incentive to stay here. And what happens when some low potential person leaves?
Someone else with high potential can come in?
Somebody with high potential can replace them. Absolutely. And ultimately, if the cycle repeats itself enough and we continue to get rid of performers and the low potentials and replace them with high-performing high potentials, eventually we got a team that's amazing with no slack. What's that?
An A team.
An A team, absolutely, instead of an AB team or a C team, yeah. So when we think about pay for potential, where I'm going to challenge the four of you to go with discussion boards is to kind of steer the discussion towards the idea that pay for potential isn't something we give everybody. It's only for the select few that have demonstrated that they're worth it. When we think about paying somebody off the street more because we think they can do something, that's a little different. Pay for potential, as I've said, is much more about I've watched you, I know you, I've seen what you can do, and I can project the path that you're on is going to take a sharp rise, and you're just going to throw on the afterburners, and you're going to be gone. You're going to leave everybody behind because you're that good, or at least I see it as a possibility, a very real possibility in you. And that's not something you typically do the first few months on the job. It's certainly not something you do before you hire them, or except on very rare circumstances. Every now and then somebody comes in and applies, and you go, on paper, you're too good to be true. But we can fudge what's on paper somewhat, can't we? All of you had advanced HR last semester, didn't you? Did some of those resumes look pretty good to you? No.
Like one.
One of them looked pretty good. Well, they're college sophomores, but we learn how to create resumes that sell, and they may not be real accurate. And you don't know that until you've been working with us for a while. So again, pay for potential. You've been here for 2 years. You've been here for 5 years. And you've done everything I've asked you to do. You've done it with a good attitude. You've done it with quality. You've done it timely. You're inquisitive. You want to grow. You may be too young to remember the TV series MASH, but you've kind of got that Radar O'Reilly quality where you just kind of anticipate. I don't have to tell you to do something because you just know to do it. I mean, and that's valuable, isn't it? In some regards it is. And pay for potential just lets us do something for the ones who are pretty amazing with the hopes that we keep them another year, another 5 years, when we might not otherwise. Well, what thoughts do you have about that? Has that conversation shifted at all what you thought about pay for potential? Ashley?
Well, to answer your question, yes. My comment was going to be, I think that probably the most important thing you can do is, if you're going to be transparent and let people know where they're falling on the grid or whatever it is, to let them know that you're not stuck in this classification. If you want to be seen as having more potential, there are things you can do. Because I think that you really run the risk of turning people off from the company if you say, well, we don't think you have potential. They're like, okay, I'm out of here. But to let people know that, you can improve and you're not stuck in this.
That's true. And we got to make sure we understand too, because we see a lot of potential in you this year doesn't mean that we still see that potential next year. And we've got to be careful about how we reward you, because it can become an entitlement of its own. I got the high potential last year, so I'm kind of cruising now. I mean, you got to continue to demonstrate that high potential. But because you didn't show, we didn't see a lot of high potential this year, doesn't mean that you couldn't move into that category next year. And the conversation is not a bad one, that you're a consistent performer. I mean, everybody wants to be the A player, but we couldn't survive without an awful lot of B players. The A players wouldn't exist if the B players weren't holding them up a lot of times. So it's not necessarily a bad conversation to say to somebody, right now, we're not seeing the off the charts potential like we do. And you know, you could probably name for me the ones that have the high potential. I mean, I don't have to tell you who they are, because you look at your coworkers, you know who has the high potential. You're solid, and we want to keep you too, and we want to reward you too. But the conversations that are really difficult is you're just not showing us much. You know, you're doing what you have to do to get by. You may be doing a great job of doing what you have to do to get by, but you're not really kind of wowing us for the future. And that doesn't mean that we're ready to let you go. It doesn't mean that we want you to go, but it means that, you know, if you want to move into this category, here's the things you got to be thinking about. You know, you can't just do what's on the job description and go home. You got to add value. What else? Before we wrap it up and go home. You're home.
I do think the term pay for potential can be really misleading and easy to misunderstand. So I feel like I really benefited from hearing what you had to say about it, because my initial thoughts and what I learned from reading and talking tonight are completely different.
Okay.
Absolutely. I agree with that.
It's interesting because midweek last week, Morgan and I had a conversation where she was a little bit frustrated because she wasn't finding a whole lot of stuff about pay for potential. And I said, well, you know, look at it, change the direction a little bit and look for this 9-box thing. And she started finding a few things there. But it's still very early in its infancy.
Mm-hmm.
Pay for potential is...
Pay for potential. I like it really sounded like paying for performance. It wasn't, you know, potential, right. I guess, isn't, you know.
This is a great topic for this class, because this really is something that you might start seeing more and more. And the more you know about it now, the more you can step into those HR meetings and say, have you thought about this? Let me tell you what the benefits are. Let me tell you what the challenges are going to be. And they're going to go, man, you are smart. You have got so much potential. This is not a hot topic yet, but it's about to be. And I would say that, especially within the framework, that's what you demand. You know, it's a foreign concept to a baby boomer to think that you might pay me for something that I'm capable of doing, but I've never shown, that I've never done. But your generation says, I'm out of here. I can find a great job somewhere else. You're not my only option. And if I think that you can be what I want you to, what holds you to this organization? You know, I would argue, we're getting into a different topic here. I would argue as a baby boomer that you got to put in your dues. And it looks like my video quality is dropping, and it may cut off my video feed here for a second in just a minute. But you got to pay your dues. You've got to wear out your time till you can get to the point where it's kind of a union mentality. You got to work your way up to that level, but you're not willing to do that. And you know, your perspective is lots of opportunities. I'm not married to this company. It's not going to hurt me if I start over somewhere else. In fact, I may come out ahead if I start over somewhere else. So if you think that I'm worth keeping, you better do something about it in the short term. And the only flexibility that I may have is pay for potential. If I see the potential, I can do something to keep you hooked for a little bit longer. while we do the growing that has to be done. You're not going to find an awful lot written about it yet. And about a year and a half ago, I was teaching this class on campus, and I had a friend come in who's in HR down the road, and he talked about this 9-box grid. And at the time, I mean, even a year and a half ago, I looked at him and like he had two heads. I was like, what are you talking about? And as he kind of described, his organization is on the forefront of a lot of this kind of stuff. And as he talked about pay for potential, I thought, God, that makes so much sense. I mean, nobody has ever thought that way before. But that is where we're going to be going. Rewarding people for what they're capable of doing as long as we've got a plan to help them get there. But not in a way that we're playing favorites. You know, it doesn't go over very well if you reward your buddy with pay for potential. You know, it's kind of like that situation where somebody gets promoted and a lot of people wanted that job, but when you announce the name, everybody goes, yeah, that was a pretty good choice. You know, I'm disappointed that it wasn't me, but I can't fault you. That was a good choice. If this kind of thing were to become public, the ones that get the pay for potential, the 10s, we ought to say, I'm disappointed that it wasn't me, and I think that I got a pretty good case for the 10, but I cannot fault you for deciding to give it to her. I mean, because she is outstanding. We know who those people are. Anytime you do group work in your classes, I'm sure it's you, but everybody in that group can very quickly point to the one who really is the superstar. We know it. All right, we better wrap this thing up. What thoughts do y'all have?
I definitely have a different perspective on things, and it makes me think a lot more about the potential versus performance. So I appreciate the call.
Okay. I would hope that if you're young with a bright future ahead of you, that you hope you work for somebody that rewards you for your potential as much as they do for your last year's performance. That kind of scares me, because at 52, I don't have a whole lot of potential left. I've already achieved much of what I'm going to achieve, but you guys have got so much of the future where you can do things that I can't even dream of. That there's so much of an advantage for you if an organization takes this approach, and you got to sell it to your bosses. This makes sense. Is there a gamble? Is there some risk? Yeah, absolutely. We could reward you, and then you could fall flat on your face. And we can't ever remove pay, can we? We can't ever dock your salary. You're stuck with it. You know, we're stuck paying you at least that going forward. So you've got to really have a lot to base it on when you recommend pay for potential. So with that in mind, do you think that we give it away easily?
No.
It's a very, very small subset of our employees that get the pay for potential. But that's, as I said, that subset, everybody very quickly points to them as the leaders. All right. Well, we do need to wrap this thing up. I got 8:59 on the clock over here and 9:01 on the clock over there. Let's stop our recording.